Good afternoon and welcome to HRTV, and it is my privilege to have with us today Mr. Ashok Gopal, who is the Head of People Development at the mighty Mashreq Bank. Ashok, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Now, I've done a little bit of research and I looked into your background, and the one thing that struck me is you came into the HR profession from a slightly unusual route. I think it's fair to say you work for Gallup, which is a data organization and a polling organization. How did that sort of transfer come about, and what was the value in coming from that sort of organization into HR?
Very great question. Actually, most people know of Gallup as a as a polling company. The reality is that much of Gallup's revenue actually comes from measuring and managing employee and customer engagement. So I spent 16 odd years working in the area of looking at the assessment of employee engagement. So to that degree, I've stayed connected with the HR fraternity for a long time without actually being a line manager in HR. After 16 years of consulting and advising companies in terms of what to do with their people, and I'd say with a reasonable degree of success, the urge came to go to the other side and to implement some of the stuff that one had been talking about. It was fascinating, it was challenging. One realizes that perhaps not all that one sees from an outside perspective can be operationalized internally. That's been the most fun actually, and that's what caused me to make the move. And 5 years later, I still say that I enjoy every single day of it.
5 years later, still driving employee engagement. And I want to come on to what makes the engagement part itself successful. But I suppose if we take a step back, where you start with is engagement is data. Now, there's the sort of data that every organization readily has available, such as staff attrition rates or how frequently your staff come in late in the mornings, things like that. But what data is actually crucial to begin a proper employee engagement process?
Okay, absolutely. Safe to say that especially in today's world, that metrics abound. I mean, so you name the metric and the chances are that the organization has a metric. But for me, when it comes to engagement, one of the most fascinating things that I discovered during the 20 odd years that I've been working in engagement is that each one of us looks at the external world and says, I want to know what's happening in organizations outside. What do they do? What are their practices? But funnily enough, when it comes to engagement, sometimes both your greatest assets and your greatest liabilities actually lie under your own roof. I've looked at over 150 organizations, and within those organizations, if you look at the range of engagement from one team to another, you go from teams that are world-class to teams that are absolutely abysmal. When it comes to engagement, not many organizations actually look at engagement at that granular level. They look at one overall number which reflects the engagement of their organization, but that number conceals a lot more than it reveals. So I'd say that if you are serious about embarking on an engagement exercise, yes, you need the overall number, you need to know how you benchmark against others, but you also need to understand what's the spread of engagement within your own organization. That's not a metric that many people look at.
Interesting. I want to pick up on that because it's something I've noticed as well. You know, over time, the more organizations I go to, because everybody's looking externally in terms of best practice for what to do, you end up with a homogenized mass of companies where one company varies so differently from its neighbor. In terms of a hiring decision, it comes down to pretty much only pay and conditions. So what can you do with engagement, recognizing those assets you have internally as well as those liabilities you have internally, to really focus and differentiate yourself in terms of culture, practices, processes from the outside world?
Let's start with something that you spoke about, which is hiring. I think that's probably the single most important decision there is when it comes to people, because the kind of people that might be hugely successful in different environments might simply not fit into your environment, your values, your culture. So hiring decisions are absolutely crucial, and many organizations believe, you know what, let's get the best people in, but the best people aren't necessarily the most successful, the most successful people that work elsewhere. They are the people who are most likely to succeed in your environment. The most successful people, if they are not going to fit into your environment, coming back to your question on engagement, when they come into your environment and find that they are square pegs in round holes, the chances are they are going to be fairly miserable about it. You are not going to get the benefit that you thought you would get by getting in the best and the brightest. So essentially, you're creating misery. Pretty much all around. Now, if you look even within organizations, I mean, so let me continue on this hiring theme. Uh, think about a promotion decision. I mean, when you promote, let's say, a brilliant sales guy, you promote him or her to be a sales manager. I'm calling it hiring because, in effect, you're hiring a person for a new position. And often, the best sales executive, and this has been spoken about ad nauseum, but the best sales executive makes a disastrous sales manager. Again, it's a double whammy for you. You've lost a brilliant sales guy, and you've created a terrible manager who works to disengage the team that he or she manages. So I'd say that when it comes to engagement, very often the single most important decision that an organization needs to take is who are they hiring to be their people managers, because those people are going to make or break your culture.
That's a perennial problem with every sales organization. So you recognize your best salespeople aren't always the best managers, but then promoting an average salesperson into a manager position, they could be perfect for management, but is it not going to alienate those high performers who may want that position, even if they're not right for it?
It would. I mean, and that's where organizations get their systems wrong. I think technology is perhaps the most advanced in terms of getting it right, which is that you can grow in different ways in the organization. Very often, I don't think people are hankering for the position because it's higher up in the hierarchy. They are hankering for the position because that's the only way they can get more money, a better title, and stuff of that sort. With higher positions, you often get the hassle of managing people, and there are people who love it, there are people who hate it. Now, the fact of the matter is, people who hate it but who are brilliant at the job that they do should be allowed to grow in a parallel stream to the conventional managerial stream.
So it's about mobility within an organization.
It's about career paths. I mean, there's an issue if the only way you can grow is to move from being an individual contributor to being a manager. If I could stay as an individual contributor, but continue to grow in terms of position, pay, and stuff of that sort, you wouldn't find people hankering for the next level. Very often, even though they are aware that it isn't something that they particularly want. I mean, the irony is that everybody seems to recognize the problem, and yet nothing happens about it. It's like volunteering to walk into quicksand. I mean, I think that's probably the way I'd look at it.
Yeah, good stuff. Great. Well, I'm going to pull it back towards data and engagement, which is what we're here to talk about in the first place. So you've got your data set. That is suitable for a proper engagement process.
Yeah.
How do you then go and build an engagement practice that actually matches the strategic values of the firm?
Fantastic point. Now, the first thing that you need to recognize, I want to talk about two things over here, which then leads into what might be the best way to drive engagement. The first thing that I want to talk about is something called the myth of organizational culture. Every HR professional worth his or her salt would talk about organizational culture. To me, it's fiction, exactly the same way as Superman and Spider-Man are. There are as many cultures that exist in an organization as there are managers or teams. So that's one thing that I want to talk about from how do you operationalize engagement. The second thing that I want to talk about is people join companies, but they leave managers. This is something that Gallup spoke about 20 odd years ago. And it resonated powerfully across the world, across cultures, across types of organizations, because it really is one of those global truths. They always say, I mean, there are three things that are permanent in life: death, taxes, and a manager. So now let's look at these two data points. Let's look at these 2 points together. Cultures vary from one team to another, number one. Number two, the manager plays a pivotal role in shaping the way people feel. What impact does that have on engagement? It basically means when you're thinking about engagement, you need to be driving engagement one team at a time. Each manager needs to take ownership of impacting the engagement of his or her team. In effect, one is saying that every single people manager in an organization is an HR manager. You can't outsource engagement to a department called the HR department. Engagement needs to be driven by every single people manager because he or she is an HR manager. They need to work within the confines of their team. 80-90% of what shapes engagement can be acted upon within the control of a team. The remaining 10%, the compensation, the processes, systems, etc., that's where leadership and an HR department come in. But 80% is within your control. Organizations end up focusing on the 20%, not the 80%.
80% is controlled within the team. That means from a policy perspective, from an HR policy perspective, or any form of regulatory perspective you might have within an organization, you have to massively decentralize and therefore allow different units to have different roles. Now, not a lot of companies would be comfortable with that, but it perhaps addresses the problem that when you engage with your staff, a lot of the information you'll gain will be subjective. It will be, I don't know, the coffee's rubbish, or it might be that my manager keeps calling me a funny name, or something like that. To reach a policy level, that data has to be quantified, so the executive team or the HR policy team can take a decision, and then that quantified decision has to come down to the team and address a subjective problem. How do you get around that kind of centralized policy decision making and the need for subjective action?
Okay, let me start. Let's talk about this centralization, decentralization conundrum. Let me start with an example, which comes from a client I used to work with some years ago in Singapore. I was talking to somebody, a mid-management level person, who just returned to work from a fairly severe health emergency. He'd been away from work for 3 weeks, and he said, I came back to work and the first thing my boss tells me is, I hope you don't expect a reduction in targets because you've been away. No question about how, I hope you're better now, how you're feeling. The manager hadn't been to the hospital to see this person, nothing of that sort at all. Now, organizations talk about building care, and they create policies that relate to reactions in emergency situations. So medical related loans and time off, this, that and the other. All of those policies are needed. Yet, you cannot create a policy for what are the kind of humane conversations that need to happen between a manager and employee, between an organization and the employee. So back to your question, when it comes to conversations, when it comes to the things that make you feel the way you feel on an ongoing basis, you don't create policy. I mean, you allow those conversations to take place. You create policy around the things that, around the big macro issues. But again, let me take one example of a macro issue, pay decisions. Now, pay decisions happen once in 6 months, perhaps once a year, perhaps, but the way you feel happens every single moment that you're working in your workplace. The way you feel on an ongoing basis is shaped by your immediate work environment. You can't create policy for that. That's like saying you create a policy for a happy marriage. You don't. I mean, you just do the things that create a happy marriage. So to repeat, the things that need policy the leadership at the HR department should create, because the absence of those may come back and bite you when it comes to engagement. But the presence of those is no guarantee for engagement. The absence of things that happen at the level of a team around creating engagement, on the other hand, is going to come back and bite you savagely, because that's what creates engagement or disengagement on an ongoing basis.
Absolutely, and that's a wonderful takeaway. And speaking about takeaways, I suppose my final question would be some advice from our audience. Now, this conference in particular, but previous conferences before I've been to, we've been exposed to some world-class thinking, some really great ideas, and you can't help to be inspired. But when I go out and I meet my clients again and I go into companies, I find there's a big gap between the ideas that are creating to actually then being reflected in the organizations. So if you had one piece of advice for our audience in terms of moving from ideas to actual execution, what would it be?
Okay, I mean, more than an idea, I think I'd call it an organizational reality, which is that leaders take upon themselves the mantle of being supermen or superwomen, as the case might be. Now, what do I mean when I say that? The Exco or the leadership group of any organization, a bunch of 8-10 people, believe that they can shape the way 5,000 people feel through the processes and policies that they create. The leaders might be absolutely brilliant, but the policies they create might be absolutely world-class, and yet it may not make a difference to that last employee working in the organization, because the only way that you can create an engaging work culture is if you do it one employee at a time. I think leaders need to recognize that the only way they can do that, the only way they can drive engagement one employee at a time, is to take it to as granular a level as possible. Interestingly, this also means that even the leaders need to look at their own engagement. They are not just working in the organization as sponsors of culture. They also need to think about what exists in the workplace. I mean, that's impacting their own engagement positively or negatively, and then need to take action that addresses it. So if leaders are willing to take that plunge when it comes to the democratization or the decentralization of culture creation, that would work a treat, and it doesn't matter whether it's the Middle East or it's Asia or it's Europe or the US. That would hold true in pretty much every geography that there is.
Fantastic. Well, we will leave it there. Mr. Ashok Gopal, I very much enjoyed myself. Thank you ever so much for your time.
My pleasure.
And to our audience, I thank you too.
Thank you so much.